Kathleen, you can continue when you're ready.
Good day all, and welcome to the session of the SADAC 2021 Annual Conference, Growing MedTech Post-Pandemic Adaptability, Resilience and Sustainability. I am Athene Saul, a member of the SADAC Regulatory Committee, and I will be facilitating this session on advancing global regulatory convergence, perspectives for the future. We really look forward to the session, and we request that our delegates please make use of the chat or Q&A facilities to ask any questions of the panelists, which we will hold until we have given each of our panelists a chance to open. The global landscape of regulatory requirements continues to evolve. For sustainability, appropriate regulations should be harmonized and should not be a barrier to patient access. There are currently several initiatives with perspectives for advancing regulatory convergence in the medical devices and IVD fields. This session explores the experience with attempts to facilitate regulatory convergence so far and what are the perspectives for the future. We will open with a 5 to 7 minute presentation from each of our speakers before we open for a robust discussion. We will start with Dr. Dimakatso Theresa Mathibe, who is the Senior Manager for Medical Devices at the South African Health Products Regulatory Authority, the SAHPRA. She has a PhD in pharmacology from the University of Pretoria, and Dr. Mathibe has worked in both the pharmaceutical and medical device industry for over 15 years. Over to you, Dr. Mathibe.
Good afternoon, again, and thank you very much for the opportunity, as well as to the invite by Summit to give an update. So if I may be allowed, may I please share my slides?
Dr. Mathibe, you should be able to share.
Okay, I can only see, it's muted. I only see, okay. Let me share that. It was only, can you see my screen?
We can, thank you, Dr. Mathibe.
I'd like to put it on the slide mode. As I indicated, thank you very much, everyone, for your time, as well as all my panel members, as well as people that are attending the conference. So the approach when I got an invite was to look at what has happened in the the past year, and what is it that we will remain, that we'll continue with as a regulator, as well as look at some of the area of improvement and also what has happened. So my first few slides will be just capturing a summary of what has happened in the past few months since the emergence of the COVID-19 pandemic. So I just said, let me give you a recent update. If you look at specifically looking at the COVID test kit, not excluding other product, but when COVID-19 started, there was a process of approving COVID-related product via the, going through the performance evaluation that was done by our NRL. So based on that, we've published the approved COVID test kits on our website, and out of the total number of product that we received, we approved about 60 antigen tests, 18% of antibody tests, and 72% of molecular tests. And another thing that has happened during this process is that the regulations for medical device was published in May of 2021 for comments, and it closed in August of 2021. We received some response from the industry, which included individual organization, as well as the various association. And we have internally reviewed this, and we will be working with the ITG group members and other responded to, to discuss some of the areas in relation to the regulations. And the intention of SAHPRA is to publish this, the regulation in early 2022. Other recent update, since last year, we have seen an increased number of establishment licenses, both manufacturers, as well as a high number in distributors, as well as, as well as wholesalers. and we have the approval increased to 62%, but the number of new establishment licenses that we received has increased by 47%, as well as on the existing licenses, we have received more than 41% increase in amendment, especially with the addition of most companies an amendment adding COVID-19 related products. Another point that I wanted to raise is that the radiation control used to sit in the Department of Health, and during when SAPRA was started, the unit radiation control moved into SAPRA, and it falls under, we have various programs within SAPRA, so it falls under the same program as the medical device unit. So it's the medical device unit and radiation control under one unit. And you know, since the unit moved into radiation control, there was some resources that were being allocated. So for example, there have been no manager for some time, but now there is a radiation control manager, and also there is a new appointment of deputy managers as well as technical officers in the unit. There will be further engagement by the sub-unit, if I can call it that way, that will be communicating with the industry regarding radiation control guidelines that will be published. It will be the same process where the guidelines will be published, comment, and then engagement with the unit. Forging forward, you know, based on what has happened in the past more than a year ago, is to look at the lessons learned as an authority. You know, what happened is that we realized there was a lot of interest that has increased, or there's a lot of companies that has interest in the medical device industry. It's a good opportunity, but it came with a risk towards compliance, because most of the entrant, if I can call them, you know, there were lots of questions for us, you know, in when they join or when they send an application, you can see that they are not coming from the medical device industry. And that, for me, it also create an opportunity for us as a regulator to engage. So you look at both sides. The risk is the compliance of the new entrants, and as well as the existing companies establishment as well. But then it also brings about the opportunity of us coming with a way forward of engaging the stakeholders to ensure that they comply to the regulatory requirements. And another opportunity that I can identify, which is not our mandate, is looking at training of the new entrant into the medical device industry. Furthermore, lessons learned, you know, we had to work with our national regulatory laboratory, NHLS, and do performance evaluation. And in that instances, you know, there was a protocol that was standardized protocol that was developed. There was, at the beginning, we had to, you know, both stakeholders, NRL and NHLS, sorry, as well as SAPRA, had to do a lot of lessons and learn. You know, there was a lot of stop and go, if I can put it, but there's a lot of improvement. If you look at the numbers that we have now, that is sitting with our with NHLS, it's only four tests that we have at NHLS. So there's a huge improvement from last year to now. So this emphasizes the opportunity of further collaboration with our NRL moving forward, especially when we're going for, I think everyone is aware that with the regulations, then there will come product registration. So this gives us an opportunity to start the discussion with our National Health Laboratory on the way forward when it comes to product registration. Another opportunity of collaboration that we had during this process is the WHO collaborative registration process. As South Africa, we applied for this and we are part of it. So it's we have to now communicate with the industry about this process, where I'm not sure if the industry, but we can communicate this offline on the CRP process, because we just became the member of the WHO CRP registration, which is a expedited process for registration. Okay, another way forward, you know, during this process, that's what I'm saying, some of the things will be lessons that we take and move forward with them, and some of them we improve on our own current system and strengthen our way forward. Look at the collaboration with other national regulatory authority, both in Africa as well as at international forum. You know, we are participating in various forums at the current moment, you know, and that helps us internally because we're using the opportunity to train our internal resources so that they you know, inclined in understanding the regulatory requirements as well as the different countries, the requirements. And this led to, you know, recognition and the reliance method that we'll be looking at as an authority. And also identifying and starting serious discussion, you know, based on the background that we have now on product collab. We're looking at performance evaluation as well as the timelines of product approval within the authority. Furthermore, we'll be looking at our preparedness. So the information that we have gathered and our collaboration and working together with other regulatory authority, and for example, with WHO, will assist us in, you know, preparing ourselves towards registration of our product, looking at the human resources that will require training as an indicator that we're using opportunities where if we have to review a document, we're using that as an opportunity for our unit or our team members to start looking at it together together on a document and looking at what other jurisdiction, for example, MIDRF inclined jurisdiction, and see, you know, and use that as an opportunity to learn. And I just want to highlight at the end of the day, the oversight responsibility of SAPRA, it's SAPRA's oversight responsibility to ensure that the products that are in our market are safe, they perform as intended, and then they're of quality. And I also indicated access. We have to, it's one of our mandate, we have to ensure that there is access of medical device and IVDs in our country. Okay. So during this process as well, and also triggered some of the areas that we need to start aligning or start working on. We have to, you know, we received a lot of applications during this process, a number of applications, not a lot, a number of applications regarding borderline products and product for designation. So we received a lot of applications, and we're working internally with other units to respond to that. So that's another opportunity, which is something that was not looked at previously, looking at exemption 36 applications. Being involved in with our other units on regulatory compliance, especially on PMSs, where we're looking at assisting and supporting our regulatory compliance in reviewing, for example, any adverse events and recalls and input from the medical device unit. And then one other area that we'll be looking at is the product registration, which we'll be publishing once we, you know, as I indicated, that we will be working on the regulations. Once that is done, we'll be publishing product registration documents for IVDs and non-IVD, for example, so for public comment. And another point that we realized that we need to prepare ourselves for the future as well for sustainability, you know, to have systems in place for emergency preparedness. You know, we don't have a shock of our life like we did when we know when COVID came in. It was not, yeah, when COVID came in. So we need to have systems in place for emergency preparedness. Another area that we need to emphasize on is the importance of harmonization, collaboration between ourselves as a regulator, SAPRA, collaboration with other regulators, both in Africa as well as international, as well as collaboration, I put it in bracket, awareness, make our other stakeholders like in industry aware of what's going on at SAPRA. You know, at the current moment, we were building our resource, and once that has been done, then we need to start coming out and speaking to the industry of what is happening. Coordination with both other national regulatory authority and including the industry, that they are aware of what's happening, you know, transparency, which leads to transparency. Engage in dialogues, whether they're difficult or not, but it's very imperative for us to understand the other perspective. And as I indicated, not forgetting that the oversights at the end, the decision of the authority, it lies with SAPRA, as I indicated. I spoke about transparencies. So I further want to emphasize the importance of convergence, you know, working towards one goal. I spoke about coordination and then engagement and transparency. With that said, that will be all from my side. Thank you very much. So I'll hand over back to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mathibe, for your update on, the recent updates and how the COVID kits are. There's a list of them published on the websites, and regarding the publication of the medical device regulations that were out for comment in May 2021, and that you're still working on the final comment for publication. The lessons learned about the increased company interest and stakeholder engagement, and the value of further training, and the great opportunities that we have to collaborate going forward. And also that we're going to be looking at, you've put importance on reliance and recognition, and that also informing us about identifying and starting the discussion for product call-ups for medical devices and IVDs. And that, there are additional areas of focus of borderline products and Section 36 exemption. Thanks for that. So now, following on from this, we look at a perspective from our SADAC neighbors, Mrs. Gugu Mahlangu, who recently retired as the Director General of the Medicines Control Authority of Zimbabwe. Internationally, she has been actively involved in harmonization of regulatory activities regionally and continentally, particularly with respect to capacity development for NRAs. And she was the chairperson of the task force that developed the African Medicines Agency Treaty. Ms. Mahlangu, what does convergence look like for the SADAC region?
Hello. Thank you for the opportunity to share what SADAC is talking about. Is this, are you going to share my slides? Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you to SAMED for giving us this opportunity to share our thoughts as SADAC, where we've been looking at the possibility of convergence of in the area of regulated medical devices in our region. I had the opportunity to work with a young man called Ev Mwamba recently in looking at this particular issue on behalf of the SADAC region. Next slide, please. So one of the things that we looked at was what is going on within the region. We did a gap analysis, or an analysis of what is going on in the region. And we noted that actually quite a number of member states do actually have some sort of medical devices regulation or acts of parliament in their regions. That there is a general need for regulatory resources or competency within the region, something that needs to be built on. Presence of local manufacturing within the region was limited. Maybe just 40% of the respondents indicated that there was some local manufacturing, although one has to define exactly what we mean by local manufacturing. There are some other parties that are involved in the regulation or quality and performance assessment of medical devices in the region, like conformity assessment bodies, there's a Bureau of Standards, and some have conformity assessment testing laboratories. In general, most of the member states have well-controlled import and distribution activities, but we noted that quite a number also have regulations in the pipeline, which means that there is an interest in looking at this area. But the SADAC looked at it from the perspective that there are 16 member states in the region of various sizes and competences in the competence of the national regulator, as well as the size of the economies. And it was the feeling of the SADAC regulators that it might be better to have one framework for the whole of SADAC, because it could impose an undue burden on some of the smaller nations if we're going to start developing effective national regulation of medical devices. Next slide, please. So we then looked at what could we possibly compare ourselves with, what else is going on out there globally. And we looked at the EU medical devices regulations, the ASEANs, what they're doing in the ASEAN region, what they're doing in South America through the MECASA technical regulation for registration of medical products. Then we looked specifically at individual countries, such as South Korea, which was a wake-up thing because they have a huge medical devices regulatory unit. But what helped, it helped us understand exactly what was required to regulate medical devices. And then we looked at within our own region what the two countries which seem to be at the forefront of developing their medical regulatory capacity. That was South Africa and Tanzania. And then we also looked at what we'll call non-region specific models, like looking at WHO pre-qualification for IVDs, what the UNFPA is doing in terms of their pre-qualification. They pre-qualify primarily condoms, but they also deal in a lot of medical devices. Then we looked at the IMDRF and the WHO global model for regulating medical devices as well. Next slide, please. So there were various lessons that we picked up from this comparison analysis. That it would be important to start off by adopting basic levels of regulatory controls in the region. We might need to use a desk approach. We might have to promote work output or information sharing, such as the MD-SAP that is used by IMDRF, some of the member states of IMDRF. We may initially have to adopt voluntary standards and guidelines, but what is important is maybe to have a common submission template that would be acceptable for all member states. Where do you start? Do you start with the products or do you start with supplier qualification? All those things are being looked at. And then we could also use the experienced competent authorities such as South Africa and Tanzania within our region as champions for the framework that we would want to adopt. Next slide, please. So in looking at the possible strategy options, we looked at the possibility of supplier listing and registration at SADAC level, so that all member states can use that supplier list because they know that suppliers in that list are ISO 13485 certified, and therefore the products in their portfolio can be relied upon. That's the basic minimum, I think, that we can start with. Or we can follow this AdvaMed approach, which is the approach that is used currently for medicines by SADAC, where you have a work sharing approach. So member states with RNAs, with the various and appropriate competencies, can jointly review dossiers that are common or from an agreed priority list of products, perhaps starting with IVDs, and look at these and then recommend them for adoption and listing within SADAC. The other option is to follow the ASEAN medical devices directive approach, where you develop and adopt common guidance documents. You draw up a framework for member states to adopt and sign. This would require that each of the member states does have some sort of competence within themselves in order to implement this. There's very little work sharing in this particular strategy. The other one could be a reliance on focal member states. So our champions, Tanzania and South Africa, could be determined to be the champions in the region, and we could use them as possible reference agencies for purposes of relying and reliance. Next slide, please. So where do we go from here? The what is SADAC is looking at the moment is the possibility of establishing a SADAC institution for medical products regulation. So this will encompass both medicines and medical devices. We want to institutionalize this process so it doesn't rely solely on particular member states or on a project, that it becomes one of the institutions that are recognized by SADAC, and member states will have to sign a memorandum of agreement to this. There'll obviously be need for stakeholder and member state buy-in, and one of the reasons why I was given authorization to come and discuss this, I guess, at Summit, is to get stakeholder buy-in in particular. And of course, there needs to be commitment from member states to implement whatever minimal legislation, such as import controls, licensing of establishment, listing of devices that we agree to at regional level. And then to avoid duplication of effort at national and regional level. Once the region has decided they've done the performance testing, there will be no need for national or member states to do performance testing for those devices at national level. And then, of course, we've got to build the relevant capacities and competencies for medical devices. At the moment, the regulatory agencies are very competent for medicines, and we need to understand that perhaps we need people with different training, different backgrounds, in the sciences fields, your bioengineering people, so that they join and become the competent officers that will deliver on this. Next slide, please. So the SADAC framework is also going to use reliance and recognition mechanisms in line with the WHO guidelines for reliance. As we said, we follow, for instance, WHO has pre-qualified quite a number of products, and therefore that could be part of the process of reliance. And most importantly, to ensure sustainability of the process and the institution, that there needs to be some sort of cost recovery structure or system for sustainability. So this is our way of looking at how we could bring about convergence, certainly within our region, but also taking into account what's going on globally, elsewhere, and particularly what WHO is doing. Thank you very much. Back to you, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much, Ms. Mahlangu. So I also looked at quite a bit in your presentation about the SADAC approach, where you've done a regional gap analysis and then you've looked at the key findings, and you've also done a comparison analysis of the different regulatory frameworks, and the lessons for SADAC that were taken away were that, you know, there need to be basic levels of regulatory control, and you were looking at a common submission template, and also to use experienced competent authorities as champions. And then there was possible strategy options as well, to do supplier registration listing and using a Zazi-Borna approach, reliance on local member states. And then you had some recommendations that we're going to establish possibly the establishment of a SADAC institution for medical products regulations, to get the stakeholders buy-ins and the commitment from the member states, and to try avoid duplication and build capacity. And the second recommendation was to use reliance and recognition, and that there is a need to establish a cost recovery structure or system for sustainability. Following on, thank you. Following on from this, next we have the chairperson of the African Medical Devices Forum, Dr. Paulyne Wairimu Kamau. The African Medical Devices Forum is the continental technical working groups under the African Medicines Regulatory Harmonization, the AMRH initiative. She is also the head of medical devices and the RVD cluster at the Pharmacy and Poisons Board, PPB, the NRA for Kenya. and she brings her experience in regulatory systems development and health system strengthening through her work at the EAC, the Regional Economic Community, the African continent, and globally as an advocate for regulatory convergence. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Athene. May I request to be allowed to share my screen, please, from you, Caroline?
You should be able to share your screen.
All right. All right. Thank you very, very much for your warm welcome. A very good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to colleagues that have joined us from different parts of the globe. It is such a wonderful invitation to be able to spend my afternoon here with you, sharing on advancing regulatory convergence in medical devices and in vitro diagnostics in Africa through the forum, through the AMDF forum, but also through my own perspective coming from the Pharmacy and Poisons Board, as was introduced, the National Regulatory Authority in Kenya. I'm going to primarily focus on the work of AMDF because AMDF targets or looks to be able to advance regulation across Africa. And our objective as AMDF is to promote our work as a technical committee under the AMRH initiative. I want to strengthen or to stress the fact about AMRH harmonization initiative. And this is an initiative that AdvaMed has been tasked with helping member states, all 47 African member states, to advance regulation of different aspects, but AMDF is specifically for medical devices. AMDF has the joint secretariat, who's AdvaMed and WHO, and through these, we are able to work to recommend, to study, and to advise member states on ways to be able to advance and ways to be able to conduct the regulation of medical devices. AMDF is supported by partners that help us to be able to develop materials such as guidelines, trainings, workshops, information that can be shared as tools to member states. And this process helps us to advise countries, especially because we have and we know of the different disparities between regulatory authorities across Africa. I want to be able to share the experience of AMDF through the eyes of the pandemic by highlighting to you the work plan, which guides and helps us to be able to tap to all regulatory authorities in Africa and advise in accordance to the level of regulation that each country is at. We have the main objective of promoting our work as indicated through the AMRH initiative. We do that by supporting the implementation of harmonized regulatory framework for medical devices and IVDs. And we do that by further strengthening and establishing platforms for sharing development in regulation, research and innovation on medical devices and IVDs. And the fourth objective is to improve human resource capacity for the regulation of medical devices. When you look at these four objectives, they are objectives that speak to all NRAs in Africa that have different regulatory frameworks and capacity. Specifically, as has been communicated by my previous panelists, that different regions have different capacities. The SADAC region has shared its view. The EAC region has also in the past had a study to share its view, as well as the ECOWAS from West Africa and the Northern Africa region. I want to give the example of, I want to share the example of the Africa Medical Devices Task Force that was put in place on 20th of March of 2020. When the pandemic was announced by WHO, we were able to quickly put together the AMDF task force. This task force was drawn from experts from WHO, regulatory experts from NRAs, and also consultants that were able to come from regional harmonization initiatives such as the Global Harmonization Working Party and the IMDRF. Through this initiative, we were able to look at four main areas. The first one was to be able to identify and to share information of lists of assays that were being used by countries to test for COVID-19, countries that had information. The WHO was very key in sharing the emergency use listing, which provided us with a number of kits or number of assays that, for example, stringent regulatory authorities such as US FDA had listed. We were able to then share this information and make it easily accessible to NRAs. The reason this is important to share is that during the pandemic, there was an acute shortage of just about everything, including information. And when there is no information or the know-how on how to do something, this becomes the first bottleneck towards accessing, towards provision of that product to a market, and really enabling and supporting market authorization. So when we were able to put together a list of assays, NAT assays, we were able to disseminate this information freely through AMDF to all the member states of Africa. And most countries were able to then use the mechanism of reliance and recognition to fast track and make available these products in their market. The second route we were able to identify was a study at a donation of medical devices and IVDs in Africa. You will remember that a lot of donations, a lot of philanthropists were taking advantage of the situation and giving donations. And when we understand and really know that donations are important in a health system, we are also acutely aware of the fact that there are donations that are not good for our health systems or in our health system. In this process, we were able to put together a guidance document for diagnostics and medical devices donations in Africa. And unique was the fact that diagnostics previously through the WHO donations guideline only considered medical equipment and medical devices. Diagnostic had not been considered for donation. So this was an opportunity for us to put our minds together, our experiences and expertise, and also include guidance documents for diagnostic. This information was also crucial because countries were able to be given a guidance document that they were able to develop and domesticate for their use in their own countries. And immediately a tool was made available for countries to use in assessing the use or the availability or how important the donated product was going to serve in the healthcare system or in their market. We also remember we saw ventilators being donated by car manufacturers. We had situations of people really not from healthcare wanting to help in combating and being able to avail products that were in shortage. And this is the other avenue that we saw appropriate in enabling and provision of guidance documents to be able to support our member states. So AMDF critically looks and studies at gaps, identifies them, and is able to put together tools to support all member states to be able to develop and enhance that area of need that has been identified. Another thing that was supported and was identified was the reporting of substandard and falsified medical products. Again, with an influx of diagnostics and medical devices, it was acutely, it was very important for us to be able to look at and recommend a mechanism from which we could advise for withdrawal, recall, and suspension of a medical device from a market or from the African continent, for that matter, that did not meet the purpose for which it was designed. So we developed guidelines and we developed standard operating procedures, as well as information sharing tools that would help countries to share information of products in their market that were not meeting standards. And by putting that information in a repository where we could all see and we could all share, this information has been extremely useful in advising countries on when to recall, when to remove a product from a market, and when to recommend for suspension, or another country can be able to share that information and know not to give market authorization in their jurisdiction. The fourth group looked at personal protective equipment. Again, this is products that were in huge shortage, and PPEs. Africa has primarily been dependent on importation, and this was a challenge of its kind. The over-reliance of importation became a hamper to trade, in that we do not have, or we did not have established local manufacturing for PPEs that would be able to help. So this was an opportunity that was identified twofold with regards to encouraging local manufacturing of PPEs. I witnessed that in my own country, where textile manufacturers were converted to be able to produce PPEs, as well as Africa. Through the African Union, we saw countries being able to provide and to produce PPEs for consumption by our domestic markets. This opportunity was presented and identified, and again through AMDF, we were able to put together specifications, we were able to put together documents that would help countries to know how, or the countries that had information shared for this purpose. We have seen and witnessed through the pandemic the need for us to use reliance and recognition, the ability of NRAs to rely on one another through mutual trust, through development of sharing of know-how. And in this process, we are able to shorten the time frame for allowing a product into a market. We have seen that prior to the COVID-19 pandemic, products that would take up to 36 months in some NRAs have taken a much shorter period of 12 to 24 months to gain market authorization. And this is something that AMDF is able to do, sharing documents on reliance mechanisms, sharing documents on recognition, and encouraging member states to be able to use the tools availed to them to ensure that we can develop regulatory frameworks. Africa has countries that are small, countries that are big, countries with developed, and countries that are developing the regulatory framework. In recognition of this, AMDF has been studying and recommending infrastructures and tools to be able to assist all countries regardless of the stage of regulation they are. For countries that do not have a regulatory framework that is in place, we are able to recommend using guidelines. We have 4 new guidelines that have been published and are available for dissemination: guideline on market authorization, guideline on inspection of manufacturing facilities, guideline on ISO 13485 quality audits, and a guideline for ensuring establishments are able to meet the requisite requirements. This information is available freely, and we want to be able to advance the regulation of medical devices so that no country and no one is left behind. And that is the primary goal and the role of AMDF. I want to stop my presentation here and say thank you for giving me the opportunity to share, and call upon regional economic community to be able to share more information and give us the opportunity to be part of it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Paulyne. It was a very insightful presentation, and obviously the topics we're covering here in the session today could be spoken about in a lot of detail further. However, obviously we do have some time constraints, so I think we would just move over to, finally, we're going to look away from the continent to harmonization within the global perspective, and Mr. Stephen Bipes, who is the Vice President for Global Strategy and Analysis, Advanced Medical Technology Association, which is AdvaMed, a trade association that leads the effort to advance medical technology in order to achieve healthier lives and healthier economies around the world. Mr. Bipes is responsible for AdvaMed's work in Africa, Latin America, and with good regulatory practices, international standards, and technical barriers to trade. Mr. Bipes also leads AdvaMed's work in the implementation of the USAID COVID-19 Medical Device Regulatory Convergence project, the MDRC. So Stephen, what does that global perspective on regulatory convergence look like?
Well, good afternoon, and thank you very much for the invitation to participate in this panel and speak with my esteemed colleagues. And I'd like to associate myself with the very informative information and international initiatives that are taking place globally and across the continent. I promise I will keep my presentation very executive, very short, so that we can have ample time for a robust Q&A. But a common theme of our work at AdvaMed globally is reducing every type of barrier between patients and the life-saving and life-improving medical technologies that our member companies manufacture. And of those barriers, there's domestic, there's international, There's tariff, there's non-tariff, there's several different categories of the barriers and obstacles. And Pascal Lamy, the former Director General of the World Trade Organization, has noted that regulatory non-alignments can are equivalent to a 20% import tariff on all products, including medical devices. So within the space of regulatory, we really look at a holistic approach, both on the health side and the trade side, and on governance as well. And I think a lot of the health elements were included here, but I wanted to know if it would be possible to load my deck, and then very quickly I will go through just a few key topics that I think will help tee up some of the Q&A. Is it possible for staff to load my presentation?
Just give me one moment, Stephen.
Okay. And when I say the health side and the trade side and governance side, it's really looking at a holistic approach. So when we're working with the health authorities, we will work with the national regulatory authorities for medical devices, the ministries of health, in some cases, the Centers for Disease Control. But we also work with the governments beyond the health factor to central regulatory coordination bodies where they exist, ministries of trade and other parts of the government that also have a role in the development of regulations as a whole beyond the medical device function. Next slide, please. And this really brings to the front the whole of government approach, focusing on medical device regulatory function and processes, and looking to address particularly acute issues and bottlenecks during COVID-19 and our recovery from COVID-19, but also working more broadly with the government on a whole of government good regulatory approach. Next slide. As was mentioned earlier, there's very good reference documents from the World Health Organization. This presentation will be made available, and all of these links go to the source document. But in addition to the Global Model Regulatory Framework, there's also the new WHO Good Regulatory Practices document, the Good Reliance Practices document, and the Post-Market Surveillance document. Next slide, please. There's the guidance from the International Medical Device Regulators Forum, in particular, their essential principles, which it provides guidance for national regulatory authorities on how to use international standards as a primary mechanism to employ regulatory reliance and recognition. Next slide, please. And those essential requirements and the recommendation of the WHO in turn are based upon the hundreds of international standards that are updated continuously from organizations such as ISO, IEC, and other organizations. Next slide, please. Beyond medical device focus, however, there's also good governance requirements from the Organization for Economic Development and Cooperation on good regulatory practices horizontally, but also the World Trade Organization and even the Africa Free Trade Agreement. Next slide, please. The World Trade Organization Technical Barriers to Trade Agreement has several key articles that all of the WTO members, including many countries in the African continent, have committed to doing, and these are also reinforced through the Annex 6 requirements for, via the AFCFTA. Next slide, please. And just very briefly, all of the countries have agreed via international treaty obligation to not make technical regulations overly trade burdensome, to remove technical regulations that are no longer required, and significantly under Article 2.4, using international standards as a basis for technical regulations. This is good for health, but it's also good for trade and part of the legal framework with which all of the countries and members of the WTO have agreed. Next slide, please. And technically, per the definitions of the WTO TBD, a technical regulation is a document with which compliance is mandatory, and a standard is a document with which compliance is not mandatory. But if you take an example, the ISO 1345 standard, it's a voluntary document. However, when a regulatory authority creates a technical regulation, they can make it mandatory by making a normative reference to it or requiring it as a part of putting a device on the product in the market. And we have found this to be the most effective means to achieve cross-border harmonization and really employ and put to practice the WHO recommendations for reliance and recognition. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. I just want to speak just very briefly on the horizontal good regulatory practices. You know, the WHO guidance is very helpful for the specifics to our sector, but when the governments also have broader requirements in how the governments as a whole conduct their rulemaking, it can remove even more foundational barriers to achieving higher levels of convergence, including for medical devices. Next slide. And we can think of good regulatory practices as a form of quality control mechanism, the same way it would be inconceivable to have a medical device production line or facility without a good manufacturing process. Likewise, the regulatory process should also have its own quality control mechanism, and GRP is that mechanism. Next slide, please. And there's many elements that go into GRP, but this is the essential list. And I'm not going to read through all of them here, but I would say some of them include having a regulatory forecast, conducting a regulatory impact assessment, conducting a retroactive review of the efficacy of regulations, and significantly using international standards and conformity assessment as a basis for technical regulations. It's also very helpful to have a central regulatory oversight body or structure. Next slide. And to operationalize the horizontal requirements, we have found it helpful as kind of a best practice around the world that when there can be a standard operating procedure or a mandatory requirement within the regulatory process pertaining to medical devices, when there's a policy that prioritizes the use of international standards, a policy promoting the engagement of the agency technical staff in the international standards development, publishing a list of the international standards used by the regulatory authority, engaging the international entities, and having someone designated to be aware of what the relevant international standards are. We know that if something is not written down and someone is not put in charge, it's likely not to happen. So having that standard executive is also very helpful. Next slide. So key takeaways are that the World Trade Organization technical barriers to trade implementation is a good regulatory practice. The use of international standards is a good practice, and the WHO guidance for medical device regulatory authorities is a good regulatory practices, and they all tie together. Next slide. So I provide my contact information here, and of course make my slides available, and I look forward to the robust Q&A. Thank you again for the opportunity.
Thank you so much, Mr. Bipes. I'm sorry we were a little bit rushed, but that obviously the good regulatory practice and the importance of, where possible, to use international standards and other, for example, WHO guidance, obviously the importance was stressed in your presentation. So we did have some questions besides in the Q&A and in the chat that I would just go straight into. So I think I would direct this probably at Dr. Mathibe. We had this question was that from an RVD perspective, one of the biggest issues that industry faced during the pandemic was that of trying to integrate new technology into a regulatory framework that was still in the process of rolling out. So the first part of the question is that going forward, will consideration be given to utilizing multiple resources at the same time instead of only using centralized under-resourced reference laboratories and pre-qualified biobanks who did experience difficulty in meeting the demands of assay validation? That is the first part, and I can just also relay the second part, and perhaps you could just answer it in one go. And that the second part is that globally there are recognized ISO 15189 and CLSI standards that could be relied upon to standardize testing protocols and batch releases. And since the start of the pandemic, multiple assays have now been stringently approved in other recognized regulatory jurisdictions. So ideally, there should now be sufficient global oversight as per any other routine assay. So the question is, bearing this in mind, will initial safety measures be lifted and managed going forward like any other critical assay, such as HIV or hepatitis?
Athen, if I may please come in. I don't have access to the questions, so if you ask all of them, I will have to remember them because I don't have access to them.
Sorry, I thought they were emailed prior, those initial ones.
Yes, so the only one that I have access to is the one on Q&A and the one on the chat. So maybe if you may, because I thought I was looking for them and you were quite quick for me. So maybe let's start with the first one and then the second one, and then maybe I answer them one by one.
Okay, so Okay, so from an IVD perspective, one of the biggest issues that industry faced during the pandemic was that of trying to integrate new technology into the regulatory framework, which is still in the process of being rolled out. So going forward, will there be consideration given to using multiple resources at the same time, instead of only using, for example, just the centralized reference laboratories that were under-resourced and the pre-qualified biobanks that did experience difficulty in meeting the demand of assays validation?
Okay. So in answering that, if we have to recognize or remember what happened with the pandemic, at that point, SAPRA hasn't started doing product registration. And if you're looking at the new, as indicated, innovation, we used both the reliance and the recognition method during the process. But then as our responsibility as SAPRA, we also had to have an oversight to ensure that all the product that comes into our market does have a safe and the quality of those products is intact. So I'll just give an example on why did the SAPRA went that direction. You know, out of that 60% I was talking about earlier, for example, of antigen test, and in that number, I mean, out of the 40%, about 168 product didn't go through, for example, based on either we didn't get there were no documents, or they didn't pass, they were not recommended for to go forward. So then it becomes the role of SAPRA, and that's the reason why performance evaluation was done, to ensure that the products that are in our market are safe. As of moving forward, as I indicated, that we will be looking at harmonization, looking at convergence, what has been done. My colleagues also spoke, for example, to harmonization, looking at the SADAC. We part of SAPRA, we are part of those working groups, and looking as well as the international standard in ensuring that, you know, the delays are minimized on the product that has already been approved, for example, by WHO and PQ, WHO, PQ, and also looking at other jurisdiction. But we have to further look at the classification, because I think one of the issues that we have identified was that most of the applicants were complaining that the product is being approved in the EU, for example, but then it's self-declaration. While we're looking at the COVID, it's a Class D on our side. So that means that we have to take what the manufacturer said, but then the other part shows us that about more than 160 product were not compliant. There were not even documents that supporting that. So in future, we'll definitely look at both when we are publishing to start doing product registration. We'll be looking for IVDs and non-IVDs, medical devices, all. We'll be looking at the process that we will be following based on the classification of the product, as well as looking at the recognition and reliance method. So I hope I've answered the question, so that we ensure that there's access of the product in the market.
Yes, thanks very much for that response. I think we're going to look at the questions that came through in the chat.
Okay.
Because as you said, you have access to that, all of you.
Okay, so I see the first one that I see is I'll start with the Q&A one. I think this is what I indicated on my presentation. There will be discussion, and there will be serious, difficult discussion, and this is one of them. And I think we will have to tackle it head on together with the industry. You know, so we will tackle it when the time is right. But for now, I'll just say that the industry was given 5 years. And I understand the other perspective of the industry, that there's no access to caps. So these are the difficult discussions that we must have with the industry on, say, how do we move forward to ensure that these quality management systems in place for manufacturers as well as distributors of the medical devices, both IVDs and non-IVDs in the market. We cannot keep on postponing, saying that, like, you know, the transition, one of the points that we picked up during our review of our public comment is that, can we not extend it by another 5 years? So we'll have to discuss that, honestly, both as a regulatory authority as well as an industry, on how do we make sure that there is safety of the product in the market and there's also compliance.
Fully understood.
Yes, another question was from Simone. On she was asking about the organogram. Yes, Simone, there is no issue with sharing the organogram, but I just want to indicate that, as I said earlier in my presentation, that we're still building in resources internally. So for example, for the medical device, we're only going to get the new managers only now in November and in December. So we'll have 2 people that are joining the unit, so we can clarify who's doing what. We didn't have that, as I indicated. That's was one of the areas that we're trying to make sure that we have warm bodies in place. So we will share that and have their responsibility clearly defined. Another point that is on the same communication from Simone was on Ms. Portia Kambula signing some of the documents. Ms. Kambula is the Chief Regulatory Officer of SAPRA, and she will still continue signing documents for SAPRA that are going to applicant, as well as with Dr. Bitumelo as the CEO of the organization. And the other question was on the ISO 13485 of the signing of the certificate, as well as the quality manual and the vigilance reporting. As I indicated, that we have started from a medical device unit to start looking at reports, vigilance reports that are coming in internally, which is, that's what I'm saying, those are the new things that, we had to start looking at, as well as the quality manual. So they will fall, and it will be reviewed by, the report will be reviewed by the medical device unit, not the medicines, as you indicated, the medicines unit. So the team that will be dedicated, as I indicated, the 2 managers, the other manager will be responsible for compliance, while the other manager and their team will be looking at registration. But all of them will fall under the medical device unit. I think I've answered all the questions regarding that. While we are supporting, so the 2 sub-unit, if I can call them 2 sub-unit, both the registration and mainly the compliance one, will be supporting the regulatory compliance in reviewing documents. And the ISO 13485 will also fall under the same compliance. Once the conformity assessment bodies has given the CAP a certificate, it will come to our unit for review, not medical device. The second question, oh, it was removed. Let me go back. Something happened to my chat, just removed now. It's on, Francisca was asking if Redcon is now physically in Pretoria. Okay, the Redcon office, we have 3 offices for Redcon. The other one is based in Durban. The other one is based in Cape Town. And the other one is based in Pretoria. So it's regional operational structure, if I can put it like that, because of the sources that are placed at the different regions. So there is a large number of sources, radioactive sources, radionuclides that are in Cape Town, and then in Pretoria, as well as in Durban. So that structure will remain. We'll have a Durban office and a Cape Town office with the Pretoria office, and all reporting to Pretoria office. As I indicated, that Redcon falls under Program 5, which is Medical Device Unit. The next question was from Kristen. This is in relation to innovation in the industry. It's a hot topic. What would you say the main impediments to ensure greater or patient-centric innovation in the industry, and how can this be overcome? Coming from a regulatory perspective, I'm not going to speak about the marketing side of it, but we have to ensure that the manufacturer of this innovative product complies to the essential principles of the product, the safety, compliance, the performance of the product, and the quality upon submission of the product. So that's what I'll speak to. But as access into the market, that will depend on what is submitted to the regulatory authority and that it complies. Risk assessment, for example, has been done, and it shows that the product is safe for use. And then I think there's a follow-up question there. With the influx of new market entrant, have you noticed an increase? Yes, and I think I've indicated that we've started looking at the adverse events. There was an increased number of AEs that are coming through that we are starting to look at, that they were redirected to us by our regulatory compliance unit, and it's being reviewed by the medical device unit at the current moment. Yeah, I think I've answered all the questions, if I'm not mistaken. I'm just going through.
Yeah, I think that, we've gone through all the questions that are on the panel. So a bit over time, I would really like to thank all our panelists for their time and their very insightful presentations that they've shared with us. And with that, I would like to close this session now. Thank you.